We're very happy to have at this moment a friend. Well, there's a lot of nepotism because all of them are friends of mine. But Sepali Kottegodha from Colombo, she will be speaking, as you know, on coping with drought, insight from experiences of women in Sri Lanka in the context of globalization. Sepali has, to her misfortune, done her doctorate in development studies, which means people like me insist that she is an academic and she insists that she is not. But she's more actively involved in Women in Media Collective, which is an NGO but doing a lot of activist and campaign work in Sri Lanka. She does teach, however, at the University of Colombo, and she's been part of our program from the beginning. In fact, when we got together in 1997 to design the course, this is the second time that she will be teaching in the program, but she was here last year as well for our Women's Studies conference. I'd like to welcome Sepali to the lectern or stage or whatever. Sepali?
Thank you very much. I must thank ASR and Bunny in particular for giving me this opportunity to come to Lahore every year almost. Even though it's only for a week, I have a lot of fun here and I really enjoy the teaching and the time I get to spend here. I'm going to read, I hope I won't read too fast, but I will read the paper as I prepared it. It's based on some studies that were done in the drought-stricken areas in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka drought is what is termed a natural disaster. It's not necessarily because so many trees have been cut down that we can directly relate it to any other processes. It may be related to what's been happening in South Asia, but I think it's part of the globalization process. The process of globalization as a logical extension of the development of capitalism in the 20th century can be seen in the rapid assimilation of production and marketing methodologies for what is now familiarly referred to as the world market. Globalization is based on neoclassical economic rationalism of comparative advantage in trade, where specialization in production would enable each country to efficiently allocate resources and distribute the benefits of high income levels and growth output among its population. The fundamental premise is that all countries are equal trade partners and all citizens of these countries have equal access to and control over resources and to the benefits that accrue through participation in such an economic system. The logic of globalization envisages that through this process of integration into the world economy, countries which may have some initial difficulties in assimilating would be able, through trade adjustment policies or taxation policies, to reduce and ultimately eliminate incidents of poverty, and all citizens would eventually enjoy higher living standards and quality of life. Over the past decade, there has been growing concern, however, that the impact of globalization has been overall unequal, both in economic as well as social terms. The poor countries remain poor, if not poorer, and the richer countries continue to enjoy the major part of economic advantage. Social and economic inequality between people remain or have been accelerated. The gender implications of globalization clearly indicate that women and men continue to have different access to and control of resources, including employment and wages. Women are most affected by the process of globalization. Economic liberalization policies have seen a rapid increase in labor-intensive and low-wage manufacturing, which primarily target women workers. Globalization has also seen a huge growth in the informal sector and increased absorption of women into low-wage, unstable work with no protection of their rights as workers. Another consequence of economic globalization has been the displacement of women workers from permanent agricultural employment into seasonal employment. Subsistence farming has been severely affected, leaving women farmers to seek seasonal employment or to look to other avenues as wage workers. Such changes in the labour market and the avenues available to women as economic contributors to their household are seen as major factors contributing to the increase of feminization of power. There is increased recognition that economic liberalization and the logical flow of globalized markets in fact exacerbate gender inequalities in a number of ways. A researcher by the name of Kagate says, while gender inequalities reproduce the poverty of families, communities and nations from one generation to the next, they also have an impact on growth performance and therefore have direct and indirect consequences on poverty and poverty reduction. Gender inequalities mediate the relationship between macroeconomic and trade policies on the one hand and the outcomes of these policies on the other. Close quote. So women and men have differential access to resources and to power and bargaining within households, which directly impact on the capabilities of its members to survive economically and socially. For example, the difference in power relations between women and men within households is manifest in the amount and type of food consumed, the frequency and type of healthcare utilized, the level of education and skills training that can be obtained, and in the ability to contribute economically and be recognized as economic contributors to the household. In situations of crisis, where the household survival means that critical decisions have to be taken with regard to employment strategies, for example, these power relations frame the strategies which are undertaken by the women and the men in the household. Hence, as I will argue in this paper, in such situations, women have to look to other avenues to bring in income to the household, which directly link them with the globalization processes taking place in the country. Countries like Sri Lanka have been integrated over the past several decades into this process of economic globalization through open economic policies, opening up free trade zones, as well as state promotion of migration for employment to West Asian countries. These policies have witnessed changes in social and economic structures that have a direct impact on gender relations. Within this overall framework, this paper will give some insights into situations of women in households which have been facing drought in the southern and the northwestern provinces in Sri Lanka. Drought in this context is termed natural disaster, and such situations are often occasions where the asymmetrical power relations based on gender in communities and societies impact acutely on the outcomes and survival strategies of victims. It is noteworthy that within the structures of gender relations in South Asia, for example, women tend to be viewed as being physically or intellectually less capable or important than men, and hence most often their views and needs are overlooked both at the level of planning for such disasters or in actual and post-disaster situations. Now, the impact of globalization in Sri Lanka is clearly most manifest in the fact that women are the biggest and most significant economic contributors to the economy in the country. This stems from the particular concept of gender capabilities that have accompanied the advent of globalization over the past several decades. These perceptions categorize women as having specific characteristics more suitable for the type of soft industries that are set up in third world countries or where required labor is imported from the third world. The bulk of Sri Lanka's foreign exchange earnings come from women's earnings in export-oriented industry, in West Asia as migrant workers, and in the plantation sector. The highest number of women entering the workforce have been largely from the 20 to 40-year age group and have been mostly absorbed into export industries in the country. For the purpose of this discussion, it is also important to note that the relatively new employment avenues, that is the export industry and migration to West Asia, have been largely sourced by the movement of women from the rural sectors of the country. In the light of these significant changes in the role of women as income contributors, both at the national as well as domestic level, it is pertinent to also recognize the contributions that women have made and do make to the agricultural economy as farmers. The involvement of women in farming is not only obvious but critical to the survival of many rural communities. In Sri Lanka and perhaps in other South Asian countries, there is little or no recognition of this fact at the level of policy. Farmers, in the eyes of policymakers, are men. This concept was given credence in the approval of a scheme recently by the government of Sri Lanka to give pensions to widows of farmers. Clearly, within this worldview, women farmers do not exist. With the integration of women into the process of the country's globalization, and the fact that the large proportion of such women seeking employment come from the rural areas, the advent of drought has serious implications not only for women's roles as farmers, whether it's recognized by the policymakers or not, as well as the strategies they adopt for survival of the household. Not only are households adversely affected in the face of disasters, but also different members of a household may adopt different strategies and utilize different mechanisms to deal with such situations. For example, prevailing gender ideology views the fetching of water for household use as a task that is performed by women. This in turn has implications to the social and cultural perception of women's contributions to the family. Hence, where there has been a drought prevailing over a period of time, it would be the time and energy of women, as opposed to men, that would be stretched in the task of ensuring a steady supply of water or of consumable water to the household. Now, in the two villages that were studied, both male and female inhabitants perceived themselves as farmers. Farming in this area largely comprised of what we call the chain cultivation, which is slash and burn, or home gardens. Paddy cultivation was what the population expected or wanted to be engaged in. So when you ask them what do you do, they say they are paddy farmers, but actually they have not been able to cultivate paddy for like 4 or 5 years. But the situation of drought and the lack of access to water, irrigated water, has seen little paddy cultivation in this area. For women, self-employment through sale of agricultural produce or as wage earners in other people's agricultural plots was seen as an important source of income, particularly for the purpose of contributing to the household income. Now, another aspect of the process of globalization has been the rapid expansion of the informal sector, whether in the urban or rural areas. The rural sector has seen the emergence of large farms cultivating cash crops for exports, such as gherkins in Sri Lanka, while labour is sought from a seemingly elastic informal sector. In the villages studied, a notable proportion of women worked as farm labourers, usually as members of labour gangs in paddy farms or farms engaged in cultivation of export crops in other villages in the vicinity, or as migrant workers in villages further away. So as they would sometimes go in labour gang to wherever paddy is cultivated out of their villages, or completely many miles out, and then such occupations also entailed at times residing in the locations where work was found. Now, in situations where conditions of drought prevail over several years, as in this particular case in the two districts, changes in patterns of crop cultivation are visible both in terms of the actual crops cultivated as well as by the gender of the cultivator. It is evident from what we found out in these two villages that during what they call the Maha season, which is the non-drought season, women and men are more actively involved in crop cultivation in both villages. That is, initially it began with there's a period where the rains come, and then there's a period where it has to be irrigated water. In the Ambara village, which is in the southern province of Sri Lanka, of the total interviewed, like 28 men and 15 women were found to be engaged in cultivating 29 types of crops during the non-drought season. In the other village, which is called Mahamadeva, there were 17 men and 22 women engaged in cultivation of 26 types of crops. With the onset of conditions of drought, however, there appears to be marked differences not only in the types of crops cultivated, but also in the persons who undertake such cultivation. In the village of Andarweva in the south, the number of men cultivating crops decreased to 16, and the number of crops decreased to 19. There were no women. In drought times, no women were recorded as being engaged in the cultivation of crops. In the village in the northwestern province, in Mahamadeva, the number of male cultivators went down to 10, and the crops were reduced to 14. And women cultivators went down to 10. As an alternative to some of the crops cultivated during the non-drought period, which are not part of the main body of cash crops usually grown in the agricultural sector, produce such as jackfruit or squash were recorded as cultivated by women. Hence, the onset of drought conditions appeared to directly impact on the gender distribution of cultivators as well as in the type of crops cultivated in the village. Men remain in cultivating those crops which they normally cultivate, albeit in reduced variety, while women have to look to other agricultural products to bring in an income. We also examined the impact of drought on livelihoods in terms of who actually sells the products of cultivation. It's interesting to note that in the village of Andhra in the south, the only produce that women were noted to be engaged in selling was fruit. This could be an indicator that as the economic situation of the household is adversely affected by drought, fruit is one produce that women can continue to rely on to bring some income. The study indicated that while both these locations are experiencing drought, access to water through other measures such as wells made a clear difference in women's ability to provide water for household. In the village in the south, water for household was mainly accessed through a common well that tended to dry up or provide less water during the time of drought. During non-drought periods, women collected water from the well. During times of drought, households depended on water from bowsers, which used here as well, I suppose, which are provided by the local government authority, or they depended on men ferrying plastic gallons, like 5-gallon containers on push bicycles or tractors. Hence, the responsibility to ensure regular supply of water to the household shifts from women to men during the drought season in this village. In contrast, in the village in the northwestern province, water for household use was provided by a common well and also through tube wells, both during drought and non-drought periods. There was a marginal shift from common wells to tube wells during the period of drought. Hence, the supply of water for domestic use was more varied and dependable in that village, and the role of women in this area of household responsibility remained largely unchanged. An important need in household survival in terms of economic difficulties arising from disasters is the need to ensure that financial resources are available. So we looked at the way in which families actually found other means of finance. The studies revealed that households in both villages had reported that during the normal times, that is non-drought periods, men tended to take loans to meet expenses related primarily to livelihoods, but in times of drought, women played a more active role because they have always continued. It's a pattern of saving, which is in Sri Lanka called as cheat to system, a sort of group savings by women on a very informal way. They become very critical to the household during times of drought. Prolonged situations of drought have also resulted in women looking for other avenues of income. Notably, there has emerged a pattern of women seeking employment in garment factories. There are daily sweatshops that have come up along with the process of rapid industrialization in the country. Such employment tended to be unstable, as there were many problems women had to confront in terms of transport, attendance schedules at factories, as well as ad hoc and often unexpected demands to work overtime. The other avenue of employment looked to by women in these villages was as housemaids in West Asian countries. This clearly had immense impact not only on their ability to earn better income, but also for the household members left behind. In such situations, where there are no accompanying measures instituted by the state or non-state agencies to minimize adverse impacts on family dependence in the absence of women working overseas, the outcome is often a further oppression of women who then face criticism of neglecting their gendered roles as mothers and housewives. Globalization and environmental disasters have critical implications for women as food providers, producers and income earners. In a situation of drought in the agricultural sector, there is clear evidence then that women's involvement in agricultural production and contributions to the household become seriously affected. The tendency is for women to move out of non-wage or family-type agricultural production into wage labor. Clearly, it is the women who are expected to find other means of income generation outside the agricultural sector. It is here that we see the implications of the process of globalization and the changes in the role of women as food producers and providers. On the one hand, the availability of employment in areas that have come about as a result of the globalization processes enable women to continue to search for means of being income providers for their household. What is noteworthy is that despite the uncertainty of conditions of work or irregularities of employment, women do undertake wage work which could assure an income for the household. On the other hand, globalization that perceives workers without rights and concerns also often has negative impact on both these workers as well as their households. The process of globalization brings in its wake a weakening of the labor movement, as was witnessed in the severe crushing of strikes by the Sri-Lankan government in the 1980s, and an environment where remuneration for women's labor is low. Adverse working conditions faced by women both in these garment factories, in the rural informal sector, or in some situations in West Asia are not issues that are given priority by the state in its efforts to integrate with the process of globalization. It is critical as well as urgent that the state is deemed accountable to the impact of such processes on the well-being of all workers, in particular on the security of women and their role and status within the community and the household. This requires significant elaborations in state policies in order that gender is recognized in a conscious and deliberate manner. The specific roles women play and can play as income earners and also as contributors of income to the household must be addressed in policy, both in the promotion of industrialization as well as in changes being made in the rural sector, where women are being pulled out of non-waged family work roles and into wage labor. The experience of livelihood and survival in drought situations discussed above are a clear pointer to the critical nature of gender in such processes. Thank you.